Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Now, just because something is made for kids, that doesn't mean it has to be bad, and that doesn't excuse it when it is bad. Something made for kids, whether it's media or literature, doesn't give it an excuse to be too basic or lazy or just poorly made. And I say this for everything. Kids deserve to be exposed to quality art as well, and they deserve to have quality art made for them because that's how they grow up learning to appreciate and love an art form in whatever way, whether that is TV or film or physical art or literature or poetry. Some of the best novels and poetry and just literature in general that we have was written for kids. Take some of my favourites, for example, like Lewis Carroll, the man behind Alice in Wonderland, A.A. Milne, who created Winnie the Pooh. They were all for kids, but the worlds they created, the characters they created, the language they use, it's pure art, and it's something that even as an adult you can appreciate and love and enjoy. There are literally tons of examples I could use in a video like this, and I am thinking of making more, but what I want to focus on today is I want to share a little poetry collection with you that was written for very young children. We're talking about like 5 or 6 years old, and it's not a very well-known poetry collection, it's not an especially fancy collection, but this is the poetry collection that made me fall in love with poetry when I was very, very little. I have such memories of this book. It was amazing. I would shut myself in this little cupboard with a torch and I would read this book for hours. I would sit nestled between a bookcase and a wall on the landing. Don't ask, it was like my safe little space. I like to enclose myself in to feel safe. And I would sit there and I would read this book and others for hours. And I would sit with my granny and I would read to her from this book. And it was what made me fall in love with poetry. It was what kind of captured my attention and made me realise how fun, but how beautiful and how relatable and enchanting poetry can be. I didn't have the original book anymore, so I've spent quite a while trying to track this down and finally found this old second-hand copy that I got for £3, which I think is great. And it's just like I remember it. It brings back so many old memories and it's wonderful. And also, can we just appreciate how beautifully illustrated this book is? It's absolutely gorgeous. So, oh my god. Reading this again, I felt like a kid falling in love with poetry all over again. It was great. Really, really great. So before we jump into the book, let's get some admin bits out of the way. First up, merch is still available if you want to go get it. Lots of people have been buying my Awesome Strengths t-shirt, which is probably one of my favourite bits of merch that I've ever made, and I'm wearing it myself constantly. I love it. It makes me feel very strong, very empowered. I love it. That's available if you want it. Link is on screen now and down in the description below. Also, lots of people have been asking me for poetry recommendations. I do have a few videos recommending lots of poetry, but if you want everything all in one place, I've added a page to my website that has lots of links to poetry collections that I enjoy, anthologies that I enjoy, and some videos with recommendations as well. So that's available on my website, racheloates.uk. That's racheloates.uk, and that will also be linked down in the description below, and I'll leave it as a pinned comment as well. Also, like, as just a little aside, all the links on there are affiliate links, so if you click on any of those links and then go on to buy anything at all, it just helps support me and my channel. I get like a few pence back from everything. It's not a huge amount, but all the little bits add up and help me keep doing things like buying poetry books from my childhood. I think that's everything. No, that's not everything. Can we just talk about this dress? These are actual butterflies on my skirt. And I feel like, sorry, I realised I just cut my head off. I feel like a princess. This is all my childhood dreams coming true. I'm wearing a princess dress with butterflies on it, and I'm talking about poetry for a living. Oh my god. 5-year-old me would be so proud. I adore this dress. As with most of my clothes, I got it second-hand from, this one I got from Vinted actually, and I bought it for like £6, and it was way too big, so I've had to hand sew the sides and bring it in a little bit, especially at the waist, but the skirt is perfect and beautiful, and oh god, I feel so pretty. I never thought I could feel this pretty. I love it. Oh, okay, sorry, just want to show that off. Okay, let's get back to talking about poetry. So, let me get my notes. Oh god, I have books falling on me. I'm kind of glad you can't see this huge stack of books I just have next to me on the settee that I've been using for videos recently. Not very good at putting things away. Anyway, This is a blue poetry paint box, apparently, chosen by John Foster, who also has a few of his poems in here, and we are going to be talking about a couple of them today. It is the simplest of collections, and it's got poems about all kinds of things that kids love, you know, dragons, mice, mermaids, space, starfish, families, castles, lots of castles, which I think is very cool. Lots of fun stuff, and it uses very basic language because of the child audience that the poets obviously had in mind when writing, and I think despite being such a simple collection, it's a very good example of the fundamentals and the basics of good poetry. If you want a really good introduction to poetic techniques done with a purpose, read poetry for kids. There's absolutely no shame in that at all. A lot of the time I have people who watch my videos and they say that they've never really understood poetry before, or they find it overwhelming, or they don't really know where to start with it. And one of my kind of like bits of advice I would say is start with poetry for kids. And I really hope that doesn't come across as patronising, because it's not meant in that way. But genuinely, poetry for kids is a really great introduction that really introduces you to the fundamentals and the basics in a really accessible way that anyone can understand. And what we're going to be doing today is looking at some of these poems written for children, picking out the techniques, looking at why they're used, and then saying, okay, now what adult poems also do this, and kind of comparing the techniques and how they're used to talk about different topics, maybe in a slightly more complex way, or just in a different way. And we're going to kind of see how that translates between audiences, if that makes sense. So from a child audience to an adult audience. This isn't to say the more grown-up poems are better. It's just in a lot of cases they're more complex, or they're touching on different topics and different subjects. They're written with a different person in mind. That's pretty much the only difference. You'll see that the techniques used are often the same and often used for very similar purposes. All that said, today's video is mostly a little nostalgia trip with a bit of education thrown in along the way, so please don't mind my little bit of self-indulgence here while I have some fun and take a little trip down memory lane. So I want to start with this poem, which I have very, very vivid memories of being the one which taught me what metaphors and similes were. Before this poem, I'd kind of seen them around, but I didn't really know what they were. I didn't have a name for them. I didn't really understand them. This is the poem that introduced me to figurative language in general. So I used to read this poem a lot because I loved this amazing artwork that went along with it, and I found the descriptions brought out the most crazy pictures in my head. And like I say, I didn't really understand why they did this, but then we actually covered this poem in school and we used it to learn about metaphors and similes, and suddenly I realised that this was a thing. Figurative language is a thing, metaphors are a thing, similes are a thing. And I had words to describe these special comparisons that I'd seen, and so I started to go out and look for them in other poems and start to be like, oh, this is a simile, this is a metaphor. And I started to think, well, why is the poet using a metaphor here? Why couldn't he just say he was very tall? Why couldn't he just say this was a big ocean, you know, that kind of thing? And I started to question poetry. So this poem and learning about it, and this was the first poem I ever really analysed. Absolute game changer for me. Not an exaggeration to say, literally changed my life. So I want to read A Giant Tale by Judith Nichols. He was as wide as an oak tree, tall as a willow. His snore was the thunder, a mountain his pillow. Each step brought an earthquake, each breath blew a gale. One laugh moved an ocean, each tear filled a pail. His mouth was a crater, with snakes for a tongue. His eyes were the size of the earth and the sun. One toe was heavy as Venus and Mars. His forehead was Saturn, his hair shone with stars. So as you can see, this poem is just all metaphors and similes used to describe this one man, this wild, weird giant who God knows where he's come from, God knows where he's going, but he's a spectacle, and I love it. So for a recap, you know, to the world of similes and metaphors, because it's okay talking about them, but we need to know what they are. We need to pin down a definition. So for a recap, because for some of you it might have been a while since you were in school, if you're anything like me. I'm getting old. Similes and metaphors are types of figurative language which are used to describe things and make comparisons without being literal. That's why we call it figurative language. Similes are a little more obvious in their comparisons. So they say something is as something else or like something else. So for example, when Kyra runs, she is as fast as a bullet. I could have just told you she was very, very fast, but by making the comparison to the bullet, you get a much more vivid picture in your head, and it provides a hell of a lot more information. So Kyra isn't just very fast, but you picture her shooting off after a ball. You picture her, this little bundle of energy. You picture someone who can go really, really fast, but only in short bursts. You picture her running with purpose, and once she's off, it's almost difficult for her to stop. Fast as a bullet tells you all that in just a few words, and that's what poetry is all about. And that's kind of why I love it, because I ramble a lot when I speak, and I find it very difficult to be succinct when I'm just talking normally. And that's kind of why I love poetry, because it boils all these big things and big descriptions and big ideas and big feelings and boils them all down to the most succinct, beautiful, simple words possible. And I'm in awe of it. I think it's wonderful. I could literally sit here and talk to you for 10 minutes about how fast Kyra is and she does this when she runs and this and this and this. Or I can just say to you, she's as fast as a bullet. And they convey the same information. And even though that's simple and that's a cliche and that's very overdone, it's still true. And the fact you can convey so much information in just fast as a bullet, 4 words, it's like magic with language, and I think it's brilliant. Metaphors are similar, but they make comparisons by saying something is something. So when Kyra is sleepy, I say she's a little teddy bear. Now obviously she isn't actually a teddy bear, she doesn't suddenly become this inanimate object with stuffing, but she is very cuddly, and she's very chilled out, she's very soft. When she's sleepy, she likes to cuddle up to you, she likes to be touching you when she likes to be touched, she likes to lay in your arms, she relaxes, she's quiet, and she provides all the comfort of a teddy bear. So again, I could describe all this to you, or I could just say, she's such a teddy bear. By using a metaphor, you get this picture painted for you that expresses a lot of meaning in very few words. There's a lot of similarities between the techniques of using a simile and a metaphor, but you'll start to kind of understand the difference in why someone might use one over the other as we start looking at examples. So, in general though, you might say that a metaphor is more direct, because you're saying this is this. It's a harsher comparison, it's a more direct comparison, it's more powerful, it's used with more conviction. And you'll see in this poem by Judith Nichols, most of what she uses are actually metaphors. There's only a couple of similes in there. So her similes are just, he was wide as an oak tree and tall as a willow, and one toe was as heavy as Mars and Venus. They're the only similes she has, while all the rest are metaphors. And you'll kind of start to understand that the metaphors are a little bit more powerful and a little more, not literal, but stronger, if that makes sense. Hard to find the right words for it. But looking at this poem in a little more detail, I also want you to know all the natural imagery in this, and I think this is such a clever choice, because she could have very easily made comparisons to almost anything, and especially man-made things. So she could have said that he was as tall as a skyscraper, or as wide as a football pitch. But the natural imagery is a really smart choice, because they're things that are universal, that we can all recognise regardless of age or culture or background. And they also make him seem a little bit more intimidating, right? Because natural things they're pretty majestic, they're kind of out of our control. They're these wonderful things that were here long before we as humans were, and that will probably be here long after we're gone. And there's something about making a comparison of a person to a natural object that is kind of a little, you're like, ooh, okay, they're pretty damn special then, you know? And take the last line of the poem, for example, about how his hair shone with stars. Now, we all know people with beautiful, shiny, gorgeous hair, and yeah, I'm talking about you, Kyra. But this is so much more. This isn't just a man with shiny hair. Think of all the man-made things that she could have compared his hair to, like it's shiny like a torch, or fireworks. His hair could easily shine like them, and you'd be like, oh yeah, okay, it's quite shiny, isn't it? Yeah. But the man-made stuff is still kind of believable and ordinary, and saying like, yeah, his hair shone like a bright torch. You're like, yeah, okay, it's quite shiny, okay, cool. But His hair shone with stars. Not only was it shining, but it was made of stars. It was so bright that maybe it would blind you to directly look at it. It was so powerful, it radiates energy. It's so completely unrealistic, and that's what makes it so magical and intense and wonderful. And you realize that this isn't just a silly looking man. This is someone special with power. He's wearing stars in his hair, almost like a god, and you start to think, who is this man? What gives him this right to wear stars in his hair? Why is he so damn special? And it raises all these questions, and you really start thinking, and you're kind of in awe, you know? As a kid reading this, you get all these awesome, like, pictures in your head of this crazy man. But as an adult reading this, you kind of start thinking, okay, well, you're describing him, but what does it all mean? What does this actually tell us about him and his character, where he's come from, where he's going, what his purpose is? What layers can we peel back in this poem and find some more meaning in? As a kid, you read it and you start to understand the metaphors and the similes, and you get this picture of what he looks like. But as an adult, you can peel those back even further and be like, okay, but who is he? Each step brought an earthquake, each breath blew a gale. One laugh moved an ocean, each tear filled a pail. This is a man whose movement literally changes the environment that he's in. He is that powerful. He's influential. He's potentially dangerous. A step, which is such a small thing, we do it every day. We take thousands of them without even thinking about it, without considering what effect that has. But each tiny step that this man makes, each movement that is so insignificant to most of us, each one for this man changes lives. He could destroy homes, ruin people's lives, kill people. He is that influential. So you start thinking, well, damn, he's powerful. And you realize that even the small actions have the biggest consequences. And it not only gets you thinking about this man, but kind of your own actions and your own movements. And you start thinking, well, I take these steps without thinking, but what consequence is that really having on the world? And then you stop thinking about it in terms of just steps and your other actions, and you think about the words and your movements and the things you do and the ways you look at people and interact with people and the things you put out into the world, and how every small action can have these big consequences. And it kind of makes you think about that, because in some ways we can all be this giant. Kind of want that to sound deeper than it did, just we can all be this giant. Kind of ruined it at the end there, didn't I? The point that I'm trying to make is there's surprisingly a lot we can read into this poem depending on how deep we want to go, but I kind of want to leave the rest up to you. And I want you to just have a think about this for yourself, and if you want, leave me a comment, because I do enjoy reading them, about what you think some of these descriptions mean. Take the one, for example, his mouth was a crater with snakes for a tongue. What do you think that means? What do you think that tells us about his character? And what do you think we can kind of learn about us as humans? About maybe the things we say and the consequences of our words. What do you think that line and the others in this poem are trying to tell us? Because I think there's a lot more layers we can peel back and do a little bit of diggying into the poem. But before I keep going on and on and on, I want us to have a think about metaphors and similes in relation to other poems and more grown-up poems. I want us to have a think about how we can take what we've learned here and how it translates to, like I said earlier, more adult poetry. If you've seen any of my other poetry videos, it's pretty much a guarantee that at some point you will have heard me talk about metaphors and similes and what they mean, and this is a metaphor for this, and so on. Being able to spot and understand figurative language is one of the most important skills you can develop when it comes to reading and understanding poetry. It allows you to really dive deeper into what the poet's intentions are, and it really allows you to kind of discover and apply your own meanings to different poems and get something different out of it than maybe other people get. I think perhaps one of the most famous metaphors out there is one that we've absolutely all heard, and it's from Shakespeare's As You Like It. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his act being 7 ages. So here the basic metaphor is a comparison between the world and a stage, right? Saying the world is a stage. This isn't a simile, this is a metaphor. He's not saying the world's like a stage. He's saying the world is a stage. As in, the world you live in is this arena where you perform a show which is your life. He extends that metaphor further by talking about other aspects of the theatre, in this case the players or the actors, and making more comparisons. So the people in the world are the actors, And then he extends that even further when he compares how people change as they age to one actor playing different roles. So once you understand the basic metaphor here, you can start searching for a bit more meaning, right? It's a comment on how we're all essentially actors performing for other people, performing alongside other people. But what exactly does that mean? Well, it raises a hell of a lot of questions. You know, if people are always performing and acting, is anyone ever genuinely themselves? Or are these characters we play our real selves because there's no other option? We have to be characters. Because who are we without interacting with other people, without reacting to other people, and without other people reacting to us? If I sit alone in my home all day, who am I? And who's going to define that? And who's going to say who I am for certain? A huge part of who I am is defined by what I put out into the world and how you guys watching react to that and interpret it. And that's a really difficult thing to get your head around, and it is difficult, especially when people interpret you in the wrong way. But that's a part of life, and it's something we have to learn to deal with and adapt to and work around, you know? You also have to remember that Shakespeare loved theatre, I mean, clearly. So is comparing life to a stage show a celebration in his eyes or a critique? Is saying each man plays several characters, is this a comment on how wonderfully diverse each person is, you know, with lots of skills and interests and how they grow and change and develop over time? Or is it a critique on how people change over time and maybe change for the worse, or how people can be two-faced, or how people don't always show the real side of themselves? Is it a critique or is it a celebration? Notice as well how he talks about all the men and women are merely players. There's no one main character. It's implied that this is absolutely an ensemble piece, meaning that no one's life is more important than anyone else's, which is absolutely true. And I think that sometimes that's what human beings forget. We get so wrapped up in ourselves, and I've been hearing the words main character syndrome a lot recently, and I think this is absolutely relevant here, because we have to remember that each person is their own main character, and it's hard, and it's really important that we as people remember that that's not true of everyone else. And I think once you get your head around that and realize that you're not that important to other people, it can be a hell of a lot more freeing, and you become a lot more thoughtful of other people, and it's just generally better, I think. So we can consider this and so much more from just recognizing and understanding the metaphor in these few lines. Combine all those questions and ideas and thoughts we have with the context of these lines, what's being said in the play before and after this, which character is saying it, that's really important as well. Combine that with contextual knowledge, for example, what we know about the author, the text, the time, the culture it was written in, and we can learn even more. And we start to put all these pieces together, and we create this like big picture of meaning, and it's just brilliant. I mean, like, for one example, there might be a little joke in here too, because as a lot of people know, the main theatre that Shakespeare's plays were performed in was called the Globe, and it's in London. It's a beautiful place, and I've been, it's great, although it's not the original because it was burnt down, but it's built on the same ground as that. Anyway, not the point. So, all the world's a stage while his shows were being performed in the Globe. Little inside joke there, little funny, yeah, I think so. Anyway, moving on. The next one I want to talk about is one oh my god, I love this one. It was an absolute favourite of mine. But I was obsessed with like pirates and smugglers, and I used to read so many books about it, and poems, and fiction and non-fiction, and this one I just absolutely love. It reminded me a lot of Janet and Alan Alberg's book, A Dark and Stormy Night, which was another book that I read over and over. And actually those two, geniuses. They wrote so many books for kids, and so many of it was like poetry and written in rhyme, and it was beautiful. And they also wrote dedicated poetry books as well, and just genius. Those two deserve a video of their own. But anyway, this isn't by them. This is by John Rice and John Foster, and it's called Snip the Sneak. I'm reading a book about smugglers and the exciting things they did, about the goods that they smuggled and the coves in which they hid. I think I'd be a good smuggler, for I could sneak in and out. I could sneak up and sneak down, and creep and crawl about. I'm going to look in the papers, where they advertise each week. I'm going to become a smuggler. I'll be known as Snip the Sneak. Mostly in this poem, I just love the storytelling aspect of it, and as you guys know, I love a good narrative poem. The kind of more abstract ones are okay, but my favourites all revolve around telling a little story or painting a picture, like a little snippet of life, something like that. But that's just a personal preference, like everyone likes different stuff. But anyway, what I think is really interesting about this poem is its structure. 3 stanzas of 4 lines each, or quatrains if you want the technical term. And in each stanza, the second and fourth lines rhyme. different rhyme each stanza. Very basic rhymes, which I think is great for kids trying to learn about rhymes and what they are and learning to recognize them, but also really important in general for helping the poem flow and giving it this really jaunty, upbeat, kind of silly, kind of frivolous tone. Clearly, this is someone who's kind of romanticized smuggling and the pirate life and, you know, that whole lifestyle, and they want to be this fairy tale version of a smuggler, not a real smuggler, and that's okay because it's a kid's poem. You're allowed to be fun and silly and do all this kind of stuff. The poem has such a light-hearted, frivolous approach, which is completely reflected in the language used in the poem and the jaunty rhythm and these fun little rhymes and, you know, the cheeky little bits of alliteration as well. Creeping and crawling through caves, a sneaking smuggler called Snip the Sneak. That one's hard for me to say with all the S's, but it's all just very fun and it's filled with hope and excitement and real passion and this excitement about all the possibilities in life and what's to come, and I love that. You can actually imagine like a little kid sat there being like, I'm gonna do this and this and this, and listing off all these big things they want to do in life. Like when I was this age, I was like, I'm gonna be an astronaut, and I'm gonna be the first person on Mars, and I'm also gonna be a scientist, and I'm gonna be a poet, and I'm gonna be this and this and this, and I'm gonna be an actor, and I'm gonna be and I just went on, and I had all these huge, big, massive dreams, and that's what the narrator in this poem has. And you hear such hope in the voice, and it's so uplifting, and I love it. That's what you want, isn't it? And this poem kind of reminds me how when I was little I had all these big dreams, and then they were kind of quashed for a long time, and I felt useless and incapable, and I was told that like dreams that I had like that weren't for people like me. They weren't for people who came from poor families like mine. All I was ever going to do was go on and do shop work, or at most I might, if I was lucky, be a teacher, but I don't know, it would be difficult. That's the kind of thing I was brought up with, and I never really thought I'd amount to anything. I was smart, but I thought that people from my background didn't do anything. You don't leave places like Penistone. No one ever does. And if you do, you're looked down on. And I did, and I am looked down on by a lot of people, but it was worth it in the end. And reading back poems like this remind me of that excitement that I had as a kid about wanting to grow up and do anything and be anything and be anyone and be someone. And I love that. I'm getting off topic here, I'm getting a bit too personal. Not the point. To compare this to, like, again, a more grown-up poem, I want to look at Evidence by Wendy Cope, who long-term viewers will know she is an absolute favourite of mine. I love how her poetry is very fun, very silly, but very clever and very well done. She gets the fundamentals and the basics of poetry down. She's never afraid to experiment with different techniques and forms and structures, and whenever she does, she pulls it off so well. But her poetry is also so accessible, and I love it. Anyway, I chose this one for comparison because while it's a shorter poem, it has the same basic structure and rhyme scheme as Snip the Sneak. The yes is still hard. And it also has this lovely uplifting message of hope. And I think when you hear it, you'll hear the same sort of fun, frivolous tone brought out by those rhymes. So while this is only 2 stanzas instead of 4, they are quatrains and they do have a second or fourth line rhyme scheme. Centuries of English verse suggest the self-same thing. A negative response is rare when birds are heard to sing. What's the use of poetry, you ask? Well, here's a start. It's anecdotal evidence about the human heart. Love that so much. One of the big final poetic techniques I want to talk about is the use of repetition, and for this we're reading an adorable little poem called The Shadow Man about a kid being afraid of the dark. You'll also notice we're going to cover things like rhetorical questions in this one as well. So in the past when I was talking about repetition in poetry, I think I went into most detail about it in my intro to poetry video, I want to say, and the video review I did of Dandelion. I've been mostly focused in the past on talking about repeated phrases, repeated lines, things like anaphora or anaphora, I'm not quite sure how you say it, things like that. But in this poem, we get a whole stanza repeated. So this is like repetition on a bigger scale than we've ever really spoken about it before. So the poem opens and closes with the same stanza, and while I'm reading it, I want you to have a think about why. This is The Shadow Man by John Foster. At night time as I climb the stair, I tell myself there's nobody there. But what if there is? What if he's there? The shadow man at the top of the stair. What if he's lurking there in the gloom of the landing right outside my room? The shadow man who's so hard to see, what if he's up there waiting for me? At night time, as I climb the stair, I tell myself, there's nobody there. And there's something about this poem which absolutely spoke to me as a kid, really tapped into those irrational fears that we have. And I'll be honest, even as an adult, it kind of creeps me out a little bit. I think it really captures that fear that we all feel in the dark, that fear going into the unknown, the way we kind of get in our own heads. John Foster uses a lot of rhetorical questions here to show this, and kind of to make us question ourselves. And, you know, the way that we logically know there's probably nothing that can or will hurt us, especially not in our own homes. We know this, logically, but what if there is? And then we have this repetition. The only stanza which is a statement and not a rhetorical question is the one that is repeated first and last. Kind of like bookends on the poem, if you will. And this is so important because with all this uncertainty throughout the poem, with all this asking questions, with all this like constantly worrying and being anxious and whatever, these first and last stanzas are giving a solid foundation and ending as our little narrator tries to muster up enough bravery to actually climb up those stairs, you know? Ending on that same stanza creates this sense of familiarity, and it acts almost like a safety net at the end of the poem. This kid is telling themselves, this is my home, these are my stairs, this is my bedroom that I play in. You know, it's a reassurance. They're repeating the stanza to reassure themselves that they're safe. They're trying to claw back a little sense of familiarity in the dark. And the repetition is also important because this is what we do when we're scared. We repeat things to ourselves, especially affirmations like this of like, there's nobody there, there's nobody there, there's nobody there. We repeat it and we remind ourselves, trying to convince ourselves. And you can almost imagine this little kid, or even yourself when you're younger, like in the dark, being like, it's okay, there's no one there, there's no one there. Like, you can picture it, you can feel it, you understand it. It's something that's almost primal in all of us, I think. And then, while the other stanzas end in a question, you know, giving us a sense of fear and uncertainty, this stanza ends, and therefore the whole poem ends with the line, there's nobody there. It's a nice, solid, declarative statement. It's a solid bit of reassurance that the character and the reader needs. It's a reminder that after all this uncertainty and nervousness, there really is no one there, and there really is nothing to be afraid of, and logic wins over in the end, kind of. The fears are still there, but you know you can overcome them. You know you're not actually in any danger. And it's reassuring to the child audience, and honestly I think it's reassuring to the adult audience as well. Because we get in our own heads as well sometimes, and it might not be about a scary man waiting for us in the dark. We might not be worrying about the shadow man anymore, but we do still have irrational fears, and sometimes it's good to be told there's nobody there. Simple, subtle poem, perfect for kids, perfect for adults. In comparison, I'd like to talk about another poem which discusses fear of uncertainty through the use of repetition and rhetorical questions, and this is called What If This Road by Sheena Pugh, I think. It's a Welsh name. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. It's hard. Words are hard. But the poem is great. What if this road, that's held no surprises these many years, decided not to go home after all? What if it could turn left or right with no more ado than a kite tail? What if its tarry skin were like a long, supple bolt of cloth that is shaken and rolled out and takes a new shape from the contours beneath? And if it chose to lay itself down in a new way, around a blind corner, across hills you must climb without knowing what's on the other side? Who would not hanker to be going at all risks? Who wants to know a story's end or where a road will go? And so in the opening we get a lot of what if questions. It's full of uncertainty, almost panic, just like in The Shadow Man. What if the worst happens? What if something changes? What if the usual becomes unusual? What if the expected becomes unexpected? What if? And it is scary, and it is uncertain, and it is kind of worrying. However, as the poem progresses, we're presented with all these beautiful images, and the panicked what if becomes more of a curious, well, what if? We realise that the unexpected and the unknown present just as many possibilities as they present potential dangers, and surely they're worth the not quite knowing. Surely they're worth taking that risk. The interesting parts of life often come from not knowing, and the good things often seem better because they're unexpected, and this poem is a celebration of that. The bad things they might happen, but surely it's better when they're unexpected, because you don't waste your time waiting for them to happen, knowing they're going to happen, worrying about them happening. And I think this is all summed up very nicely with the question at the end of the poem. And it's interesting that this one, unlike The Shadow Man, ends on a question, but I think in this case it's more of a hopeful question, more of a question of possibilities, rather than a question of anxiety. And it ends with, "Who wants to know a story's end or where a road will go?" And it's a lovely, lovely possibility. He opens it up and it leaves the poem and the reader's life and the reader's experiences very open-ended. There's no definites, there's no certainty. It's just, who wants to know? Because what if? And I love that. It's lovely. Brilliant. Anyway, that's kind of where I wanted to end this today before it gets too long. But thank you for letting me indulge in a little nostalgia by reading this gorgeous little poetry book. I loved this so much as a kid, and it's so nice to revisit again as an adult and have all my memories still there, and for it to still live up to how great the memories were as well. So yeah, I loved this. If you would like more videos looking at poetry written for kids and kind of comparing it to other poetry or whatever, then I would love to do it, because there's so much that I didn't cover. Like, by only looking at this one book, I missed out on so many amazing poets that I absolutely adored as kids, you know, as a kid. I was one kid. But, you know, people like Spike Milligan, Benjamin Zephaniah, Lewis Carroll, Edward Lear, A.A. Milne, you know, the Albergs, everyone. There's so many people that I didn't get a chance to cover in this, just because they weren't in the book. I'm a little overly anxious today. I'm sorry if this is kind of coming across on video. Anyway, thank you for watching. Like I say, I'd like to make another poem in this kind of series if it's something you guys would be interested in, but let me know. And don't forget, check out my poetry recommendations on my website. Check out my merch because I love it. Follow me on Instagram if you want to follow me anyway, because that's where I post most regularly, and that's where I've been posting about all these paintings and stuff I've been working on recently, and fun stuff like that. But for now, thank you for watching. If you've liked this, please leave a like on the video, leave a comment, because it helps with engagement and getting my videos out there to more people. If you're new here, it would be great if you want to subscribe for more book-related content and educational content. I also talk about science and history and all kinds of fun stuff. And thanks for being here today. I appreciate you a lot, and I'll see you again very soon.